Marie will not be with us today because she's at a conference in Yerevan. She's delivering a lecture on the cherubim and the seraphim and how the Septuagint tradition failed to distinguish between them.
Nice.
Yes.
Has she been in Yerevan before?
Yes, it's a very nice city. It's a country which is very well disposed towards the Russian people. I have been there many times in Soviet period and later. And after the start of the war, Armenia became one of the hubs for Russian people who flee from the war.
I took a course on Armenian from my friend once, but it's very hard for me. I don't remember very much.
Yeah, but there are some texts, especially apocryphal texts and parabiblical texts that have reached us only through Armenian version.
That's why I wanted to get some knowledge of it. I think I did use some Armenian in one article I wrote. But I think I screwed up the Armenian, so, which my friend who's Armenian is good noticed after the article was published. So
Yes, it's an Indo-European language, but quite distant from the languages that we use.
yeah, I was struck by how few cognates I recognized.
Okay, let's start our seminar. Так. Отец Ириней, готовы вы прочесть нам несколько строчек? Отец Ириней, вы с нами? Возможно, что с отцом Иринием какая-то помеха. Лариса, а давайте мы просим вас взять на себя функции чтеца по отношению к стихам 2-4.
Kai proseltontes farisaioi, eperoton auton, ei existin Andri, gynaika apoliusai, peradzantes auton. Goda apokritais, eipen autois, ti humin eneteila to Moises. Goida eipen, epetripsen Moises biblion, апостасию, грабсай кай аполюсай.
Да. Ну, я прошу прощения. В своем переводе, как вы видите, я не всегда стараюсь передавать греческую личную форму русской личной формой или греческое причастие русским причастием, но стараюсь каждую клаузу передавать русской клаузой, либо причастной, либо с личной формой. К Иисусу подошли фарисеи и стали его искушать. Я думаю, это наиболее естественный перевод для греческого имперфекта. Спрашивая его, вставка, может быть, другой вариант, было бы стали его искушать, двоеточие, можно ли мужу разводиться с женой, и кажется, так было бы хуже. спрашивая, можно ли мужу разводиться с женой. Иисус же в ответ на апокритейс спросил: а что вам Моисей заповедовал? Здесь, мне кажется, очень интересный момент, что Иисус говорит про то, что Моисей что-то заповедал кому? Вам. Ти юмин энетейлата Моисес. Такого рода обращение у нас очень естественное для Евангелия от Иоанна, где постоянно Иисус, обращаясь к иудеям, подчеркивает разницу между собой, его учениками и иудеями. Для Марка это несколько, мне кажется, нехарактерная вещь, и это, может быть, стоит остановиться. Они ответили: Моисей повелел написать «Библион апостасию». Я перевожу это как свидетельство о разводе, как еще нужно перевести, грамоту о разводе, грамоту о расхождении и аполюсой, буквально отпустить ее и развестись. Я думаю, что, наверное, все-таки технические термины, поэтому и Библию на апостасию, и аполюсы можно перевести русскими техническими терминами: свидетельство о разводе и развестись. An important question on the level of words arises with this question: τι humine enateletomoisis. Such a way of addressing Jesus' opponents is very common in the Gospel of John, where there is a certain distance between Jesus and the Jews. But is it natural for the Gospel of Mark that Jesus, speaking about the community of those who follow the law of Moses, stresses that what has Moses prescribed to you, not to us, but to you, excluding himself from this community? To me, it looks a bit like a John 9 and not a Markan feature. What would you say?
I mean, I think it is open to the possibility that Jesus in Mark is distancing himself from Moses. Of course, I think his attitude is dialectical because in Mark, Jesus acts like Moses sometimes, like in the feeding miracles. But I think that, especially since I see Mark in a kind of Pauline sphere, the possibility that he's distancing himself at least from some of the things that Moses said, I think that's possible. Of course, he's going to go on to appeal to another thing that Moses wrote in Genesis about male and female, he made them. So if he is distancing himself from Moses in verse 3, he's embracing another aspect of Moses' revelation in verse 6. But I think in favor of your interpretation is verse 5. Moses wrote this because of, or towards, or for the hardness of your hearts. And there he's also using the second person plural. I was just looking to see, does Matthew retain this? And I guess Matthew leaves out this whole verse. Well, though in Matthew chapter 19, verse 7,
Mhm.
the Pharisees come back, and they say, why did Moses command to give? And so, that's somewhat like the terminology here.
Joel, can you show me the verse once again? I'll open it on the screen. Matthew.
Well, so let's start at Matthew chapter 19, verse 3.
Verse 3, okay.
Mhm.
Kai proselfnau to Farisaiui, perazantes auton, kai legantes. Existem tropo apalusai tenguneika auto, katapasan aitian. This is
Yeah,
important addition. We spoke about it last time.
yeah. And then Matthew leaves out this further conversation in which Jesus asked them, "What did Moses say to you?" So I was looking to see if Matthew had left out the humene, but he left out the whole conversation. But then later on, the Pharisees do say something that recalls this, but they also don't use a pronoun. So anyway, I think, I think that the Mark chapter 10, verse 3 is open to the possibility that there is some distancing going on. Though, as I say, I think it's dialectical. He's rejecting, one aspect of what Moses said and something that Moses said in the law, but he's going back to the beginning of creation. So it's somewhat like, the move that Paul makes in Galatians 3, where, he views the law as something that came in later and doesn't have the same force as the original promise to Abraham. So it's a similar jump from Deuteronomy, or the commands of the law, back to Genesis, which of course is part of the Torah also. So both Mark and Paul before Mark, goes back before the law to the story of stories of Genesis.
Yes, I think it may be interesting to compare this text with another passages where Mark refers to the law of Moses. For example, Mark 7, the dispute about Moses' prescription to honor father and mother.
So here Jesus is, he's citing Moses as an accusation against the Pharisees.
Yes, he cited Moses as an accusation, but she does not say Moses got apen, you mean.
True. Well, he doesn't have the humene. Yeah.
Yes. You see, I'm a linguist, so I always try to build an exegesis on some clear linguistical things. And my question is it meaningful that sometimes when speaking about Moses having said something to the Jews, Jesus adds a humene and sometimes omits a humene? Here, for example, in Mark 7, Moses gar apen without any humin. In some sense, Jews includes himself and his opponents into the community to whom Moses has given this prescription. Timaton pateresu kaiten meteresu. Humeis delegate. Moses has said something both to us and to you, but you, Humeis, you do not follow the prescription by Moses. Acuruntes ton logon to teu and to Moses, the paradosi humon by your second person plural, by your tradition. So,
So here he's opposing tradition to the scripture.
yes.
So
So,
it's different from denying, from in Mark 10:3 or whatever it was. He seems to be relativizing what Moses said. Here he is valorizing what Moses
Yes.
says in order to denigrate their tradition.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting point. The absence or presence of this small humin is very significant because it signifies two completely different attitudes towards the law of Moses. In one case, Moses has said something to all of us, and in this case, this humin is wouldn't be in place. Here in Mark 10, it's about that part of law of Moses that Jesus, at least Mark and Jesus, wants to abolish. And here this humin,
or to relativize him.
Yes. It's a very interesting thing. I would like just to maybe to continue searching for humin in order to look whether there are other places where this humin can play this or that way in the context of discussing the law of Moses. The continuation of this verse, 10:5. Pros ten sklerokardien humon, egrepsen humin. In these 3 verses, 3 times, Jesus uses this second person plural in order to pinpoint and to stress that this commandment, it's commandment given to you, not a commandment that we should obey. A lot of cases of
There's a
humus and
lot of humin and humon in Mark.
Yes, there are a lot of humin and humon in Mark, but it seems that only in these 2 places we have this mean.
A similar question you could raise about, if you look at Mark chapter 1, verse 39, there he
No,
says,
1,
chapter 1,
verse
verse
39.
39. Yeah. Wait a second. Elthen keruson eis ta synagogas auton. You know,
Yes.
he came preaching in their synagogues. I think it's the only time in Mark that he uses this. But, you know, so that also may be distancing. It's their synagogues,
Mm-hmm.
not Mark's synagogues. This this becomes more dramatic in Matthew, where that their synagogues is used a lot, or your synagogues language, and that also seems to me to be distancing, though it may just be distancing from your synagogues versus our synagogues. Your synagogues, you know, under the influence of the Pharisees are bad, but ours, you know, where we interpret the law correctly, are good. But it's this, you know, similar question about the usage of the pronoun. Is it distancing?
Yes. But you do not have in Mark or in Matthew any expression like our synagogues.
No, we don't. That's true. But still, you can raise the question, are your synagogues, is it your synagogue versus our churches? Or is it your synagogues versus our synagogues? Or both? I think, yeah, Matthew uses ecclesia. I think he's the only gospel to use it. And I think he uses it twice in chapter 16 and chapter 18.
Yes. I think that nowhere in the New Testament we have synagogues with the reference to Christian communities.
Well, in the Epistle of James, you have something, I'm pretty sure, hold on a second.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Angar eis selten eis synagogen humon.
Yeah. I mean, here also, it's, you know, he's saying this to people that he disagrees with, but at least the way I read it, he's talking to his own sort of community. And it's interesting because I think that this letter reflects, you know, Jewish Christianity and even a form of Torah observant Jewish Christianity. So
Mhm.
it's interesting that uses synagogue for seemingly his own sort of assembly.
Yes, there are even some motifs in James that we can regard as anti-Pauline.
Yeah, I think so, and I think James and Matthew have some things in common. Oh, well, I think maybe Matthew also is anti-Pauline. Yeah, the James 1:1 is very interesting, you know, because it's addressed to the 12 tribes
Of
in the
Israel.
diaspora. Who are those 12 tribes? You know, especially since by the first century, you know, there was only one or knowledge of one or two tribes.
Yes, but verse 14 to 14 looks as a direct dispute with Paul. Tito ofilos reformoi,
Yeah.
and istin legitis echein, ergada me eche. This is just a quotation from Paul, but with a different perspective.
Yeah. Actually, my first published article was on the Epistle of James, on the Yetzer Hara in the Epistle of James. So yeah, I mean, I see James in a Torah observant and anti-Pauline context. And it's interesting because
It's interesting.
Paul uses you know, Abraham, and he uses the quotation from Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God and it was accounted for righteousness, in order to say that justification is not by works of the law. James uses the same verse for the exact opposite. And he says that, without works, your faith is dead.
Yes, exactly. It's interesting that you compare here James with Matthew as probably witnesses to Torah observant early Christian communities, but I do not remember in Matthew such an obvious controversy with Paul as we have here in James. So Matthew, on the one hand, is Torah observing, but can we say that at the same time, Matthew is still more in line with the Pauline Christianity than James, which in fact attacked?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a matter of controversy. Um, I tend to see Matthew as at least possibly anti-Pauline. Matthew, back in Mark chapter 7, where you had the dispute about hand washing, which then develops into Jesus, saying the thing about nothing from outside can defile you. And then Mark tells you that thereby he cleansed all foods. Matthew takes that out, takes out the thing about cleansing all foods, and he reduces it back to just the question of hand washing. Whereas I think Mark starts with hand washing and then elaborates it into the larger question of kosher foods and says that all foods can be eaten, and Matthew eliminates that. So why does he eliminate that? It seems to me probably because his community still observes the kosher laws. I don't know. There is a scholar in the last 20 or 30 years who has argued strongly that Matthew also is anti-Pauline. And I guess I'm more or less convinced by him, though I grant you that there is nothing that is so directly polemical against something that we recognize as specifically Pauline in Matthew as in this passage in James, which seems to be a polemic against Paul's justification by faith.
Okay.
But we should let's do Matthew next. After, when we're finished with Mark, let's go to Matthew. In like 5 years or so.
Yes, no, I think that we can finish with Mark within a year or so. So if the end of the world doesn't come, which is quite possible, then we can proceed from Mark to a comparative study of the synoptics.
Okay. Good idea.
But let's return to our place where I also suggested, at least with regard to our place that we are reading now, it would be interesting to compare it with Matthew, because here, okay. Скажите, есть ли еще какие-то вопросы или предложения касательно мелких вот, деталей того текста, о котором мы сейчас говорим? Перевод или какие-то отдельные греческие вещи, прежде чем перейдем от уровня слов к уровню экзегезы пассажа в целом. Any questions or suggestions? Тогда, может быть, мы все-таки вначале еще прочтем стихи дальнейшие. 5-9, может быть, вот так вот. Мы прочли вопрос, который фарисеи задали Иисусу. Давайте посмотрим, что здесь Иисус отвечает, а после этого попробуем сравнить этот эпизод в целом с его версией у других синоптиков. Лариса, вы наш чтица сегодня, правильно?
Ну, хорошо.
Тогда вам большой кусочек с 5 по 9 стих, окей?
Годе Иисус эйпен аутоис, простен склерокардиан юмон, эграпсен юмон тен энтолен таутен. Аподеархес ктисос арсен кай телю, epoiesen autus eneken tuto kataleipsei anthropos ton patera autu kai ten metera kai proskoletesetai prosten gynaika autu kai esontai hoiduo eisarka nian Goste uketi isin duo alamia sarks. Go un hoteos sunedzeuxen anthropos me хоридзетай.
Спасибо, Лариса. Иисус сказал им: это из-за вашего упрямства Моисей написал вам такую заповедь. Но в начале творения Бог сотворил их мужчиной и женщиной. Но если говорить про перевод, я здесь вставляю слово «Бог». Возможно, что здесь это тоже некая такая фигура умолчания. Вот. Не так понятно, кто их створил. Ну, это, конечно же, цитата из «Бытия». «Потому оставит человек отца своего и мать свою и соединится с женой своей, и будут оба единой плотью. Так что их уже не двое, но одна плоть. И так, что человек не разъединяет то, что Бог соединил». Если говорить здесь про уровень слов, то здесь вот именно читая комментарий Джоэля, я встретился с истолкованием этого текста, которое заслуживает рассмотрения. Just refer to where you refer to Gundry, with regard to the interpretation of prose. I'll show your commentary to all of us. In strictly grammatical terms, prose tense sclerocardien humon might mean in order to bring about the hardness of your hearts.
Mm-hmm.
The meaning that's compatible with the meaning of prose. In Greek, we should have been very polite and even in some sense over polite. Can we say it in English?
Yeah. Ultra Pauline, you could say. Ultra.
Как? How?
Ultra Pauline.
Ultra polite, окей. Да. Ультра полинистическая точка зрения.
Or overly Pauline.
Yeah. Overly polite. Okay.
Yeah, you can tell I was tempted by this interpretation, which Gundry had said before me, but I think I wasn't ultimately convinced.
So the idea of Gundry was that Moses gave this prescription to the Jews of his time in order for them to demonstrate their sinfulness.
Yeah, or even not, yeah, or even in order that they might become sinful. And I think I compare it there to Mark 4, in order, hina, in order that they may look and never see, etc., in order that they might not be forgiven. Right? So there in chapter 4, I think there definitely is this idea of a divine intention that some people become sinful, that some people don't see.
Yes, that's Mark 4:12.
Mm-hmm.
To you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to them all these things are in parables, Ina blepentres blepusin, kai me idosin, kai kundes akusin, kai mi siniosin.
Yeah, me pote epistreptose.
Yes.
And here he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 6, and Isaiah goes on to use the hardness of heart terminology, I think.
Yes. That's like Revelation 22:11. Let sinners sin even more, and the righteousness, let's follow their righteous way. so
Yeah,
that
and-
ultimately everyone must get to the point where he's Protestant from the beginning. Do you see that
Yeah.
this ideology, that this worldview that we have in Mark 4?
Well, and I think in favor of that, I mean, I'm not sure it's there in Mark 10, but in favor of this general worldview is, so Revelation is the prototypical apocalyptic text,
Mhm.
and I think there's strong apocalyptic elements in Mark also. So, just the sort of idea that God predestined some, to not see, some to have hard hearts. God, hardens Pharaoh's heart. So certainly, at least some passages from the Old Testament are familiar with this idea that, uh, hardness of heart can come from God, though of course, elsewhere in Exodus, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. So you have in Exodus both Pharaoh hardening his heart and God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And I think that the latter aspect is definitely picked up in apocalyptic works like Revelation.
Okay, let's then return back to our place. Can we follow Gandhi in applying this worldview to our passage? Can we interpret this in such a way as Moses gave this wrong law to the Jews specifically in order for them to do more sins?
I guess you
heard,
could, yeah, for some reason I didn't go that way in my commentary, but I can't remember why not.
let's return to this because I haven't read this work of Gandhi, and for the first time in my life, I met with this idea in your commentary when you was citing Gandhi.
Mhm.
It looks, of course, it looks very much like Paul's attitude towards the law of Moses. That the law of Moses was given to the Jews specifically in order for the sin
Yeah.
to be their master.
So, yeah, what do I say in the next paragraph, though? But despite considerable
Suitable evidence for Paul evidence. Okay, let's look next page. Mark in general, seen the introduction, and those who see Marcus interpreter. In this particular case, it is probably narrow to read Mark through Pauline lenses.
Okay.
The next representation of the purpose of the law in Galatians and Romans is at odds with the usual Old Testament and Jewish view.
Yeah. So I guess what I end up saying is if Mark, I mean, this is a really radical idea, that God gives the law in order to increase sin. And, you can cite some Pauline passages for it. But I guess what I end up saying is if Mark really wanted to convey such a radical idea, he could have done it more clearly. Whereas it's possible to interpret the pros here, as I say in the next paragraph, as with reference to, with a view
Yes.
to your hardness of heart.
Yes, as a concession. That's the exegesis that I met everywhere in Orthodox tradition and in scholarly literature. Before I came to that reference to Gandhi.
Yeah.
But maybe in this case, Gandhi's idea is a bit too extravagant.
But I thought it was worth mentioning, just because it's a very interesting idea that has some echoes in Paul, and I thought for other reasons that Paul and Mark are close, and it's I didn't feel required in my commentary to mention every idea that anybody had ever had about a particular verse, but sometimes I mentioned ideas that I thought were interesting, even though probably wrong, because they raise important questions, and I think this is an example.
Yes. Okay.
But
That's
the things that I talk about in the next paragraph, I'm very interested in still, the idea that you get in some Jewish texts that certain things, that you find even in the Old Testament are concessions. Like there's, different passages from First and Second Samuel about the monarchy. Is a monarchy a good thing or a bad thing? And you really have very contradictory statements about that. And I'm also wondering about sacrifice in that regard, especially because I'm now working on Stephen's speech in Act 7, which ends up being very negative about the temple, and I think probably about sacrifice. And and you do have things that seem on the surface to be anti-sacrificial, again, within the Tanakh, like in Amos, and so on. So just this, and the later rabbis, we know they really, they thought that the temple had been built as a concession in order to limit the idolatry of the people. This is what Maimonides ends up saying, that the people originally were sacrificing all over the place to idols, and so God tried to limit it by restricting it to one place. And then eventually he abolished the temple entirely by having it destroyed in AD 70. So the rabbis, I think many of the rabbis are very anti-sacrificial, and they view sacrifice itself as a temporary concession to the human propensity to idolatry. So I'm making a comparison.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. If you can send us a letter with the references to these rabbinic letter passages that you have just mentioned, it should be very, very interesting.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's what I'm working on right now, but I can cull some things and send you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's interesting to me because there's later Jewish Christian groups, pseudo-Clementines, they're very positive about the law, but very negative about sacrifice. And so they have to develop a theory about why sacrifice was instituted in the law. And they come up with an idea of, which they take from Ezekiel, of that God instituted deliberately negative laws. There's one or two passages in Ezekiel which say that. So they think that what they call false pericopes have entered into the law, which are responsible for things like sacrifice. That was a very, very radical notion. I don't know. I think this whole question is very interesting.
Thank you. Before we move any further, I would like to show the participants of our seminar the places that we mentioned in our discussion with Joel, because probably not everyone has these passages in their mind and in their memories. First of all, that's Paul. That's, wait a second. That's Paul, Romans 5:20. This is one of the most radical statements in Paul's letters against the law, against the nomos. Nomos de paraesalten. Закон пришел гина, чтобы плеонасе то параптума, чтобы умножилось преступление, чтобы умножилось отпадение. Потому что в несколько такой парадоксальной мысли Павла здесь у нас там, где в результате закона Моисеева, если закон Моисеев приводит к тому, что в мире становится больше греха, то тогда это способствует также умножению благодати и в конечном счете приводит к тому, что приходит Христос, чтобы спасти мир от этого греха. Вот в контексте этого «nomos da paraeselten» и на «plaunasse to paraptoma» закон пришел, чтобы увеличить преступление. Идеи Гандри, хотя мы ее и отвергли, но она не кажется столь абсурдной, как нам может показаться, если мы ее будем рассматривать вне контекста.
I think Rasputin from your great Russian history, he liked this idea that, you have to increase sin in order that grace may abound.
I think our Russian history is much more straightforward than the very controversial and dialectical thought of Paul.
Yes. Okay. But I think Rasputin was a monk, right? So I think he did appeal to this idea of sort of redemption through sin. At least that's what I got from my book by Gunter Grass, The Tin Drum, where there's some discussion of Rasputin. But anyway.
It's another question. I think that probably this is a very idiosyncratic reading of this tragical episode from Russian history. But even before Romans, we have a very puzzling statement even in the Old Testament. It's Ezekiel, chapter 20, verses 24 through 25. Ezekiel 20, глава 20, стихи 24-25. Они не исполняли мои заповеди, отвергли мои субботы мои, осквернили, обратили взор к идолам. И тогда что же я, Бог, сделал? Я не стал их обличать, а я дал им повеления пагубные, законы, несущие гибель. וגם אני נתתי לכם חוקים לא טובים, ומשפטים לא יחיו בכם. Заповеди, по которым нельзя жить.
And these Jewish Christians, pseudo-Clementines, they cite this specifically. as part of their interpretation of sacrifice as something that was not according to God's will or his ultimate will.
Yes, and of course, on the other hand, this passage like this were important for Gnosticism as a demonstration that the God of the Old Testament was not the good God at all.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far you take it. I mean, Ezekiel also has a passage, I forget where it is, where he cites the thing about that God judges to the third and the fourth generation, and he revises it. He says, "You shall no longer hear this saying."
Yes,
So,
I think that this particular verse from Ezekiel is also outstanding in the Old Testament in its paradoxical and tragical meaning.
yeah,
But
radical, yeah, and
radical.
yeah, and this is central. I don't know if you've read Bernard Levinson's work, but he's worked on Deuteronomy as a revision, or this, and so his work is very controversial. But to me, it's convincing that Deuteronomy is deliberately and self-consciously revising some earlier forms of the law, and the author or authors are calling attention to what they're doing, and as part of his analysis, he turns to these passages from Ezekiel as a further example of revision, inter-Tanakh revision.
Yes. If you also sent us this reference, we would be
Sure.
grateful.
Yeah, I'll send you. Yeah, I think I have some articles of his. And some people don't like this, because I mean it raises, big theological questions, but I'll send you the reference, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Вот в какие глубины к теологии апостола Павла, к спорам апостола Павла, точнее говоря, к спору с апостолом Павлом в послании Иакова, к провокативному пассажу из книги Иезекииля, мы ушли, обсуждая значение предлога «прос». Но все же таки, в конце концов, и Джоэль в своем комментарии, мы сейчас в обсуждении этого комментария вернулись к традиционному пониманию. Моисей написал такую заповедь не для того, чтобы евреи были упрямы, не для того, чтобы через, как пишет Павел, через приход закона умножился грех, а все-таки просто-напросто уступая вашему упрямству. Но в начале творения Бог сотворил их мужчиной и женщиной. Я выделил здесь желтым выражение «аподархес ктисос», но что задумался, что означает здесь это буквально от начала творения. This expression, «аподархес ктисос», does this refer to the golden old time before the fall? But probably in this case, apo is not the best preposition. Or does this mean that this situation, this attitude between man and woman, Arsen, I tell you, is from the good old time and till today. Is it
Well,
in the old time or from the old time till now?
well, yeah, I think so because I mean, why is he citing the Genesis story? He's citing it because I think really he's citing it because he wants to get in that it's according to God's will that man and woman come together and they become one flesh, and that's permanent. I think that's the point of verse 8. And I think I argue in my commentary that he seems to have a very kind of physical and metaphysical attitude that the act of sexual intercourse creates a permanent bond that can't be broken. That seems to be where he's driving in verses 8 and 9. And that was God's original will as expressed in the Genesis passage. And the Moses passage, the concession for divorce happened later, and it doesn't overrule the original will of God, which I think in terms of apocalyptic thinking, the Endzeit is a return to the Urzeit. And so he's saying that the quote law of Genesis 1 and 2 is the main thing, and what comes in between doesn't revoke it. Or maybe that he's restoring the original version of the law, which is, because now it's the end time.
Okay, so while we were talking about this verse, I decided to write it not in the beginning of the creation, God created them, man and woman, but from the very beginning of the creation, God created them, man and woman, which will be close, I think, to apodarches, to apo, and closer to what you said about the Old Testament background of this passage. The last word, at least, as far as I understand, that we should look at here is this word anthropos. Onkotos syn edzexen anthropos me oridzeto. On the one hand, of course, obviously there is a position between God, theos, and anthropos, human being. Здесь, прежде всего, противопоставление между Богом, что Бог соединил, тот человек пусть не разъединяет. Должны ли мы понимать здесь, что речь идет про человека вообще, или вот в контексте того, что мы здесь смотрим на этот текст сквозь призму послания апостола Павла, это некий такой специфический выпад в сторону тех людей, из-за жестокосердия которых Моисей дал такую заповедь. Should we understand anthropos here as a reference to human being as such? There's no position between God and human being as such. And human being as such, though the human being is tempted to disobey God, this temptation shouldn't be followed. Or anthropos here refers to the concrete and peculiar situation of the Jewish people and Moses, who gave this prescription because of their stubbornness.
I mean, it's one of several passages in which Mark opposes the human to the divine, right? In chapter 8, verse 33, after Jesus, has said that he has to suffer and Peter has objected, Jesus says to him, "U phrones ta tu theou Allah ta ton anthropon." You do not keep in mind the things of God, but the things of human beings, right? So there's that same, and you also have it, don't you, in chapter 7, I thought you had it in chapter 7. I'm not sure I was right about that. But yeah, I guess it raises a question, is the anthropos who's in mind here Moses, right? I mean, again, that would be a radical interpretation of it, and I think probably that that's not right, and that it's just saying that God's original will was for a permanent marriage, and that human beings shouldn't violate that original will of God.
Okay.
Speaking as a divorced person myself, I can say that, this isn't the interpretation I would like the passage to have, but it seems to be what Jesus is saying here. But it's interesting that the church didn't. This is a very categorical denial of the right to divorce, and the church found that it couldn't live with it. And so you see, already in Matthew, and then in Paul's letters, that they're citing this tradition, but they're revising it. So that just saying something about the hermeneutics of this. Yeah.
But here we come to a very important question, methodological question, which we meet not only with regard to this topic, but everywhere. Mark is written after the genuine Pauline letters. Mark is Pauline and even post-Pauline. But on the other hand, despite this chronology, we regard Mark and Jesus as earlier, more authentic, and more original than the recommendations for the early churches that we have in Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if Mark is in a Pauline sphere, he probably doesn't agree with everything that Paul said. So I guess here he is more rigorous and maybe more in line with Jesus' original views on the subject than Paul was, even though Mark is in a Pauline sort of realm.
So even though Mark is post-Pauline and obviously in many regards dependent on Paul, he still had access or probably had more interest in the authentic sayings and deeds of Jesus than Paul.
Well, I think that's obvious, because he, I mean, there are some echoes of Jesus' teaching in Paul, and people have written articles about them, but that doesn't seem to be his main focus. And some have even argued that, Mark was written in order to not only preserve these traditions, but because Mark thought like the life of the earthly Jesus was important in a way that Paul doesn't seem to acknowledge, even though, as I say, he does cite some sayings of Jesus from time to time. But for Mark, at least the ministry of Jesus is, central to remember. And because maybe for Mark, if you don't center theology in the life of Jesus, then you can just float off into the realms of metaphysical speculation, and things are not grounded in the historical Jesus in the same way. But the other point you make, I think, is also important, just from a technical point, that later works can preserve earlier traditions. So even though, say, Matthew and Luke are based on Mark, sometimes they have different versions of sayings of Jesus, which may be earlier than Mark's version. And even in the Gospel of John, which, mostly is not as moored to the historical Jesus, I think there's some evidence of Jesus' tradition that isn't there in the synoptics. So even though that's, later towards the end of the first century, probably, it still preserves some historical tradition.
Okay, so can we say that in some sense, Mark, despite all his closeness to Paul in some theological matters, is also in some sense anti-Pauline, namely in that he counters Paul's attitude to historical Jesus as something completely irrelevant. We do not know anything about Jesus in flesh, and do not want to know anything about Jesus in flesh. And as kind of polemics against this, Mark, though being in Paul's sphere of influence, wrote a gospel about Jesus in flesh.
Well, I wouldn't say he's polemical, but I guess I also would agree with you that he doesn't agree with that particular saying of Paul from 2 Corinthians or wherever that's from. For him, Jesus kata sarka is important to know about. And even, somehow his life and his teaching and his suffering and the way he died and the way he rose again, that's the the model and the paradigm, and not only something to be imitated, but something to be lived into. Which again, ultimately, I think that's a Pauline thought too. You know, about suffering with Jesus, like in his passage about the thorn in the flesh. He seems to have this idea of participating in Jesus' suffering.
Okay, so going back to our text, this means that now we are moving from the level of words towards the level of meanings of big pericope, that the attitude towards divorce that we have here in Mark is more, should be regarded as more authentic than what Paul wrote about sexual matters in his letters to early Christian churches.
You know, I guess I don't like the word authentic because it implies a value judgment. But I guess I would say that, I mean, Paul does cite the saying of Jesus, but then he goes on to say, but, you know, if the unbeliever wants to depart, let her depart, right? So he is acknowledging the tradition, he just feels free to revise it. Probably in view of, you know, the experience of the communities that he knows about.
But Mark also lives within these communities, and his community also faces the same problems, the same problems of practical life that Paul faced while writing his letters. But Mark still thought that some tradition that he had about Jesus' sayings is more important than any practical considerations.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's, you know, it's sort of like the school of Shammai versus the school of Hillel amongst the rabbis, right? They disagreed about the occasions for divorce, but they recognized each other as part of the same community. You know, we don't really have the school of Shammai calling the school of Hillel heretics and vice versa, even though they disagree about a lot of things. So I guess that's kind of the framework in which I would put the apparent disagreement here between Mark and Paul. Disagreement within a community.
Okay. And one last question before we go to comparison of the schools of Hillel and Shammai. Why don't you like the word authentic?
Because, you know, authentic, as I say, it implies a value judgment. You're always looking for the more authentic. You know, you want to buy an authentic postage stamp and not a counterfeit postage stamp. Whereas I think maybe somebody like Paul or John would say something like, well, yes, Jesus said that, but what did he mean by it? Do we have to interpret it literally? And don't we have the Spirit which allows us to apply Jesus' words, you know, to our own situation? And isn't that authentic also?
Okay, and what adjective would you suggest as a replacement for authentic? Early or what?
Historical, or Yeah, but when New Testament scholars use the term authentic, I think they are usually implying a value judgment. You know, they're implying that, uh, say, the church or the gospel writers have covered over the original meaning of Jesus, and we have to dig out the original meaning because that's what we're interested in is the historical Jesus. But of course, Jesus has always been like filtered to us through the church, you know, beginning probably beginning with, oral people who were remembering sayings of Jesus and then people writing things down, uh eh, but it seems to me that when you say, this is the authentic saying of Jesus, you're implying that that's the really important thing. Whereas it may just be the start of a process of an interplay between the memory of what Jesus did and the way in which that memory has been filtered and thought about and reinterpreted.
Okay, but we just agreed that probably the attitude that we see here in Mark, Jesus' words and his attitude is more something than what we have in earlier Pauline letters. What
It's probably
adjective would you put in place of something?
yeah, yeah, no, yeah, good question. I guess I might just use a phrase. It's probably closer to what Jesus actually said.
Okay, so we distinguish between the notion of words being closer to what Jesus actually said and the notion of authentic words. These are two
Yeah,
different.
because I mean, you can in modern American English or British English, you can say he's not an authentic person. There's something phony. There's something false about him. He's just uh, he's just playing a part. And so authentic has this that as I say, authentic has this implication uh, of realness and value and a value judgment that I would want to avoid because I think the whole process is authentic. The whole process is it doesn't revelation doesn't stop with, you know, what Jesus said someday in Palestine 2000 years ago.
Okay. Okay. Мы отошли от нашего текста к обсуждению каких-то методологических вопросов, но мне кажется, возможно, вот обсуждение этих методологических вопросов, тем более с таким человеком, как почетный гость нашего семинара Джоэль, это может быть даже важнее для нас, чем какие-то чисто филологические или лингвистические детали. Лариса, согласна?
Да, я согласна. И мне очень нравится церковность этой позиции.
Okay. I just said that for the last 10 minutes, we digressed from our linguistic and philological discussion towards discussing the problems of methodology and theology to some extent. But I think that is, in some senses, probably even more important than looking into small details of linguistics or philology. Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry for smuggling theology in from time to time. But
Yes, but probably the whole business of biblical scholarship is somehow connected with smuggling theology.
yes, I guess the important thing is to know when you're smuggling theology in and when you're not.
Okay. Joel has just mentioned the discussions between the school of Shammai and Hillel on the matter of divorce. Second. Yes, here we are. We can look at these texts directly in the Talmud Bavli, treatise Gittin. Let's look just at Mishnah, just in order to better understand the Jewish context of what is going on in the Gospel of Mark. Bet Shammai Omrim. People from Bet Shammai say, Lo Garesh Adam et Ishto, Ella Im Ken Matzah Ba Dvar Erva. A man may not divorce his wife unless he finds about her Dvar Erva. And the context implies that for the school of Shammai, Ervat Davar, Dvar Erva, is some forbidden sexual behavior. For example, sleeping with another man. Bet Hillel Omrim, and people from Bet Hillel said, Afilu Higdiha Tavshilo, even if she Higdiha burned his dish, Tavshilo. In ellipsis, we have man can or may divorce his wife with the same scripture reference, Kimatsa Bar Erbat Davar. Obviously,
Yeah, so it all comes down to how you define ervat davar,
yes. Yes,
which is not defined in the text from Deuteronomy.
yes, exactly. So there are two different understandings of the difficult Hebrew expression, Davar Erva or Ervat Davar.
Which is a strange expression. It should really be davar ervat or something like that, right? I mean,
Yes,
naked
probably
is
this is
somebody-
one of the cases where in the status constructors construction we can change words, the order of words without any significant change to meaning.
And there's other examples of that in the Tanakh.
I'm sure we can find some other examples, but by the moment I cannot remember of any.
Well,
But
and this discussion, it illustrates why I think, it's even more relevant for Matthew, because in Matthew they ask him, may a man divorce his wife for any reason, pasa aitian. So that's essentially what the Beit Hillel ends up saying here. You know, for you can divorce her for just about anything, even if she burns your soup.
yes,
Whereas the Jesus is closer to the Beit Shammai. And Matthew also introduces the exception clause. You can't divorce except in the case of adultery, and that corresponds to what Beit Shammai says in this passage.
yes. In some popular interpretation of the controversies between the Jewish sages of the Mishnaic time, we can read that Beit Shammai were people more cruel, while Beit Hillel were people more liberal. But here, of course, this opposition between more cruel and conservative and more liberal is within the male-oriented society. So there's being more strict and more liberal with regard to male component of the society. And Rabbi Akiva, who is remembered, among other things, for his love for the Song of Songs and being so romantic, is quoted as Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rabbi Akiva says, "Afilu matzah acheret na'a haimena," even if he finds another woman better looking than her, and also finds a scriptural quotation, Shenemar, because it said, "V'haya im lo timtza chen be'enav," and if she finds no favor in his eyes.
Yeah,
This
which is
was,
important because it's from the proof text, that the whole thing is based on.
yes, exactly. Yes, this is the world within which all the discussion that we read about happens. No one except Jesus, even not Beit Shammai, take such a strict position on divorce as Jesus did.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about, there's some Qumran texts that we could look at which may forbid remarriage after divorce, though it's controversial. But yeah,
Yeah.
Jesus is taking a very strict position.
Okay. Once again, we return to this question of historical Jesus and the opposition between authentic, non-authentic, or if you would like, between what is closer to the sayings of earthly Jesus and what is later. Can we take Mark's gospel as a witness that this position that we read here was closer to what historical Jesus said than position of Paul, let's say?
I think so, probably. But well, and you see Paul struggling with. Maybe next time we should look at the passage where Paul cites this, and he seems to acknowledge, there's a difference between what he has from the Lord and his own opinion, and he acknowledges the difference there, and what he says he has from the Lord seems to be close to what you get in Mark. But then, you know, what's interesting is then he feels free to revise the thing from the Lord on the basis of his own reasoning.
Yes.
Um,
You have a page from your commentary, Joel. You see you have very passionate readers in Russia of your commentary, where you speak about, have a reference to the Qumran texts, but probably here we enter from the level of individual words, we enter the big problem of what was the problem of divorce treated in the Judaism at that time, and then in early Christian church and so on. Probably we should deal with this next time. But of course, the question is here. Can we say that Jesus, the historical Jesus, made a tremendous shift from the attitude towards the problems of marriage, remarriage, and divorce from what we had in Judaism towards what later became a kind of orthodoxy, for example, Catholic Church? Or was this shift not so radical? Whether Jesus had some precursors in Jewish tradition of that time? Let's talk about all these things next time.
good.
Thank you, Joel.
Very good. Thank you.
Спасибо
See
всем,
you.
кто с нами был сегодня.
До свидания. До скорого.
До скорого.
До свидания.
Спасибо, до свидания.
Мне кажется, интересная была у нас сегодня дискуссия.
Мгм.
Да, очень.
Замечательно.